The Dog That Changed a Life, A Miraculous Journey. Part 1. A soldier's return to an empty world. The war was over. But for Daniel Carter, the battle was just beginning. He had spent years in the military, serving in some of the toughest environments. He had seen things he could never unsee, lost friends he could never get back, and carried wounds, both visible and invisible, that refused to heal. Now, returning home to a quiet, unfamiliar world, he felt more lost than ever. The crowds of the city felt too loud. The silence of his apartment felt too empty. And the nights were the worst. But what Daniel didn't know was that help was on the way, in the form of a four-legged stranger who would change his life forever. The weight of coming home. Daniel had been honorably discharged, but there was nothing honorable about how he felt inside. He was supposed to be relieved. He was supposed to be happy, but instead, he felt detached. Everything he once knew had moved on without him. His friends had their own lives. They didn't understand what he had been through. His family was supportive, but they couldn't reach the depths of his pain. He struggled with nightmares, the echoes of explosions and gunfire still fresh in his mind. Sleep was a luxury he no longer had. At night, he would sit in the dim light of his small apartment, staring at the walls, drowning in memories he wished he could forget. His therapist suggested support groups, breathing exercises, medication. Nothing worked. He was alone in his battle, or at least, he thought he was. A meeting that changed everything. It was his best friend, Michael, who first brought up the idea. "You need a dog, man," he said one day over coffee. "Something to pull you out of this." Daniel scoffed. A dog? He barely had the energy to take care of himself. How could he take care of a pet? Michael sighed. Not just any dog. A service dog. Daniel hesitated. He had seen military K-9s in action, brave, disciplined animals that worked alongside soldiers. But the idea of having one for himself felt strange. Still, something in Michael's voice made him consider it. And so, a week later, Daniel found himself standing outside a veteran service dog training center, staring at a group of dogs playing in the yard. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, until one dog found him, meeting Atlas. Among all the dogs in the training yard, there was one that stood out. A large, strong, black Labrador retriever with soft brown eyes and a steady gaze. While the other dogs were jumping and playing, this one sat calmly, watching Daniel. And then, without hesitation, the dog walked straight up to him, not wagging his tail wildly, not jumping up, just walking up and sitting beside him, as if saying, "I see you." The trainer smiled. "That's Atlas, and I think he just chose you." Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure why, but in that moment, for the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. A skeptic turned believer. The first few days were awkward. Daniel wasn't used to having company. Atlas, on the other hand, was completely at ease, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. At first, Daniel wasn't sure what to do. Atlas followed him everywhere, even when he didn't ask him to. When Daniel woke up from nightmares, Atlas was already there, resting his head on his lap. When anxiety hit him in public, Atlas would nudge his leg gently, grounding him. Daniel hadn't realized how tense and guarded he had been, until Atlas helped him breathe again. One night, after another nightmare, Daniel sat at the edge of his bed, his hands shaking. Atlas, as always, was there. But this time, he did something different. He took Daniel's sleeve in his mouth and pulled him toward the couch. Then, he jumped up beside him, placing his head in Daniel's lap. It was so simple, so instinctive, and yet, it was exactly what Daniel needed. For the first time in a long time, he felt comforted, and he realized maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Part 2. Breaking down the walls. Atlas had entered Daniel's life at a time when he felt completely lost. But even with a loyal companion by his side, he wasn't ready to heal yet. Trauma isn't something that disappears overnight. It lingers. It clings to the mind like an unwanted shadow, whispering doubts, fears, and memories that refuse to fade. Atlas was there to help Daniel move forward. But first, Daniel had to let him in. The first real test. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who openly shared his struggles. Even with his closest friends, he had always been stoic, reserved, and reluctant to talk about the past. So, allowing Atlas into his life was harder than he expected. He wasn't used to having someone depend on him. He wasn't sure if he could trust himself to be responsible for another life. And worst of all, he wasn't sure if he deserved this kind of unconditional love. Atlas, however, was patient. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't need words. He just showed up, every single day, without fail. And slowly but surely, Daniel began to change. The first step outside. It had been months since Daniel had willingly gone anywhere that wasn't absolutely necessary. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping felt overwhelming. The noise, the lights, the people. It was too much. But this time, he wasn't going alone. Michael had invited Daniel to grab lunch at their favorite diner. At first, Daniel refused. But when he looked down at Atlas, who was already sitting beside the door, leash in his mouth, ready to go, he sighed. Fine. It was just a small outing. Just lunch. How bad could it be? Facing the outside world. The moment Daniel stepped out of his apartment, his chest tightened. The sounds of the city, horns blaring, people talking, the distant wail of sirens, hit him all at once. His breath quickened. His mind flashed back to a different kind of chaos, the battlefield, where every loud sound meant danger. Atlas sensed it immediately. He stopped walking. Then, without hesitation, he leaned against Daniel's leg, pressing his warm body against him. A grounding technique. Atlas wasn't just offering comfort, he was pulling Daniel out of his head and back into the present. Daniel took a deep breath, then another, and with Atlas beside him, he kept walking. The diner incident. By the time they reached the diner, Daniel was exhausted. The walk had taken more out of him than he expected. He didn't even realize he was tensing up again until Atlas nudged his knee under the table. A silent reminder, breathe. For a while, things were okay. Michael kept the conversation light, cracking jokes and keeping Daniel distracted. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of people walked in, laughing loudly. One of them dropped a metal tray onto the floor, and the sudden clattering sound echoed through the small diner. It was just a tray, but to Daniel, it sounded like gunfire. His body reacted before his mind could stop it. His hands shook. His heart raced. His vision blurred as his mind was dragged back to a place he swore he had left behind. He was about to get up, about to leave, when he felt something. A warm weight pressing against his leg. He looked down. Atlas had moved closer, his head resting gently on Daniel's lap. His eyes, steady, calm, understanding, locked onto Daniel's. You're here. You're safe. I'm with you. Daniel gripped Atlas's fur, grounding himself in the moment. He focused on the dog's breathing, slow, steady, reassuring. The shaking stopped. The noise faded. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control again. The aftermath. When they left the diner, Daniel was still shaken, but he was also grateful. For years, he had felt like a prisoner in his own mind, trapped in a cycle of memories he couldn't escape. But Atlas had reached him in a way that no one else could. Michael noticed it too. You did good today, he said as they walked back to the apartment. But you know what? That dog, he did better. Daniel chuckled softly, ruffling Atlas's ears. Yeah, he really did. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Part 3. The night that changed everything. Atlas had already proven that he was more than just a dog. He was a lifeline. He had helped Daniel take his first steps outside, helped him manage his anxiety, and given him a reason to wake up every morning. But Daniel's healing was far from over. Because trauma doesn't just fade away, it lingers, waiting for moments of weakness to resurface. And on one fateful night, Daniel would find himself in his darkest moment yet. A moment where Atlas would do more than just comfort him. A moment where Atlas would save his life. The weight of the past. For weeks, things had been slowly improving. Daniel and Atlas had settled into a routine. Morning walks that kept Daniel active and present. Evenings spent on the couch, with Atlas resting his head on Daniel's lap. Small victories, like going to the grocery store without panicking or making it through the night without nightmares. But healing isn't linear. Some days were good. Some days were worse than the battlefield. And on that particular night, the weight of everything he had been through came crashing down. The breaking point. It started with a dream. The kind that didn't feel like a dream at all. The kind that dragged him back into the past, forcing him to relive the very things he was trying to forget. The dream was always the same. The mission, the explosions, the screams, the faces of the ones he couldn't save. Daniel woke up in a panic. His breathing was ragged. His hands were shaking. His entire body was drenched in sweat. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. In his mind, he was back in the war zone. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. The moment of despair. He stumbled out of bed, his chest tight with panic. He didn't even realize he was crying until he felt the warm tears streak down his face. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in. His past felt inescapable. And for the first time in years, a dark thought crossed his mind. Maybe I don't want to keep fighting. Maybe this pain wasn't something he could ever outrun. Maybe it would be easier to just let go. He felt so incredibly alone. But he wasn't alone, because Atlas was there, a guardian angel in fur. Atlas had been asleep beside the bed. But the moment Daniel started spiraling, Atlas was awake, alert, and watching. He saw Daniel struggling to breathe, saw him clutching his head, his body trembling, his mind somewhere else entirely. And Atlas acted instantly. He nudged Daniel's leg, hard, forcing him to acknowledge the present. He placed his massive paw on Daniel's arm, applying pressure, a technique trained service dogs use to bring their owners back to reality. And then, he did something he had never done before. He let out a low, steady whimper. Not loud, not demanding, just soft and full of concern. It wasn't just a sound, it was a plea. Come back to me. And for the first time that night, Daniel heard something other than the echoes of his past. He heard Atlas. The turning point. Daniel blinked. He was still shaking, still struggling to breathe. But then he looked down at the loyal dog sitting in front of him, refusing to let him slip away. Atlas's brown eyes locked onto his, filled with something Daniel hadn't felt in a long time. Love, understanding, a reason to hold on. And suddenly, Daniel broke. Not in the way he had feared, not in the way he had dreaded for years. He fell to his knees, wrapped his arms around Atlas's thick fur, and sobbed. For minutes, maybe hours, he cried into Atlas's fur, releasing years of pain, guilt, and grief. And Atlas? He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stayed there, pressing into Daniel, grounding him, saving him, because that's what he was there to do. That's what he had always been there to do. The morning after, Daniel didn't remember falling asleep, but he remembered waking up. For the first time in years, he woke up without feeling lost. Atlas was still curled up beside him, watching him carefully, as if he was making sure Daniel was still here, still fighting, still breathing. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel burdened by that thought. For the first time, he felt grateful. He ran his fingers through Atlas's fur and let out a shaky breath. Thank you, he whispered. Atlas let out a small huff, wagging his tail. He had known, all along, that Daniel just needed time. And now, they had all the time in the world. Part 4. Learning to live again. Atlas had done something no one else could. He had saved Daniel from himself. That night, in the darkest moment of his life, Daniel had almost given up. But Atlas wouldn't let him. He had pulled Daniel back from the edge, not with words, but with love, patience, and unwavering loyalty. Now, for the first time in years, Daniel didn't wake up feeling like he was trapped in a war he could never escape. For the first time, he woke up and realized he wanted to live. But wanting to live was just the first step. Now, he had to learn how to live again. A new beginning. Daniel knew he couldn't do it alone. So, he reached out to his therapist, told him about what happened that night, and admitted something he had never admitted before. I need help. The words felt foreign at first, but as soon as he said them, He realized he meant them. And just like that, things began to change. Step 1. Facing the past. Daniel had spent years running from his past. The memories of war, the loss, the guilt. But running never made it go away. So, with Atlas by his side, he decided to face it head-on. He started attending group therapy for veterans, something he had resisted for years. He shared his story for the first time, his struggles, his pain, his fears, and he listened to other soldiers who had felt the same, who had fought the same battles. For the first time, he didn't feel alone, and through it all, Atlas was always there, sitting beside him in therapy, pressing against him when emotions ran high, reminding him, in his own silent way, "You're safe now. You're not alone." Step 2. Finding purpose again. Daniel's whole life had been the military. When he was discharged, he lost more than just a job. He lost his identity. For so long, he had believed he was only useful as a soldier. But Atlas had taught him something different. He had shown Daniel that he was more than just his past. So, Daniel started searching for something new, something that made him feel alive again. One day, while out on a walk with Atlas, he saw a dog training center for veterans, a place where former soldiers trained service dogs for others like them. And something inside him clicked. That was it. That was his new mission. Step 3. Giving back. Daniel signed up to volunteer at the training center. At first, he was just helping out, walking the dogs, assisting trainers, learning the basics. But soon, he realized he was good at it. He understood what these veterans were going through. He understood the kind of help they needed. And most of all, he understood the power of a dog's love. Because he had lived it himself, Atlas had saved him. Now, he wanted to help others find their own Atlas. The moment that changed everything. One afternoon, Daniel was paired with a young Marine named Jake, who had just returned from deployment. Jake was exactly like Daniel had been months ago, closed off, withdrawn, convinced that nothing could help him. Daniel saw himself in Jake. And Jake didn't trust anyone until he met Atlas. The moment Jake sat down, Atlas walked up to him and pressed his head against Jake's chest, the same way he had done for Daniel that night. Jake, who hadn't spoken much all day, broke down in tears. He held onto Atlas, sobbing silently, and for the first time, he let himself feel. Daniel watched from the side, his throat tight with emotion, because in that moment, he knew this was what he was meant to do. A new purpose, a new life. Daniel officially became a service dog trainer for veterans. He worked with soldiers who had lost hope, just like he had. And Atlas? Atlas became the star of the program, a living testament to what a dog's love could do. Through training dogs, Daniel wasn't just helping others heal, he was healing himself. Because now, when he woke up in the morning, he didn't feel aimless. He didn't feel lost. He had a purpose again. And that purpose was helping others find the same peace he had found. The final lesson. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch watching the sunset, Atlas beside him, he realized something. Months ago, he had thought he was rescuing Atlas. But the truth was, Atlas had rescued him. Atlas had saved his life, given him hope, and led him toward a future he never thought possible. He reached down, running a hand through Atlas's fur. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail and leaned into him, and Daniel smiled, because for the first time in a long time, he was happy. Part 5. A future worth living for. Daniel had spent years believing his best days were behind him. He had been trapped, a prisoner of his past, haunted by memories he couldn't escape. But Atlas had given him something he never thought he'd have again. Hope, purpose, a reason to keep going. And now, for the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was truly living. A new mission begins. Daniel had officially become a service dog trainer, dedicating his life to helping other veterans find the kind of healing he had found through Atlas. But his journey was far from over. Because healing isn't just about one person. It's about lifting others up, helping them find their own way forward. And Daniel was determined to do for others what Atlas had done for him. The veteran who reminded him of himself. One day, A new veteran arrived at the training center. His name was Chris, a former Army medic. Chris was just like Daniel had been, haunted by memories of the battlefield, struggling to find his place in the world. He sat in the corner, arms crossed, barely speaking to anyone. Daniel knew that look. He had worn that same look for years. So, instead of pushing, Daniel did what Atlas had done for him. He sat beside Chris, quietly, without pressure, without expectation. And then, he introduced him to a dog named Luna, a young, eager German shepherd with the same gentle spirit as Atlas. Chris didn't react at first, but then Luna did something unexpected. She walked right up to him, rested her head on his knee, and let out a soft sigh. Chris stiffened, but he didn't pull away. For the first time, Daniel saw a crack in the walls Chris had built around himself. And in that moment, Daniel realized this was why he was here. This was what he was meant to do. The moment of reflection. Later that night, Daniel sat on his porch, watching the stars. Atlas lay beside him, his head resting on Daniel's leg, just like he always did. Daniel ran his fingers through Atlas's fur, his mind drifting back to the man he used to be, the man who had once believed his life was over. And now? Now he was helping others find their way back to life, just like he had. He let out a deep breath and smiled. Guess we're making a difference. Huh, he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail, as if he understood. And maybe he did, because he had always known, even before Daniel did, that this was where they were meant to be. The award that changed everything. Months later, Daniel was invited to a veteran appreciation event. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to being recognized for anything. But when he found out that the event was to honor the impact of service dogs in veterans' lives, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about Atlas and everything they had built together. During the ceremony, Daniel was asked to share his story. He stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, Atlas sitting proudly beside him. He took a deep breath and said, I used to believe I was beyond saving, that my life ended the day I left the battlefield. But then I met this dog, and he taught me something I had forgotten. He taught me that life doesn't end when we struggle. It ends when we stop fighting. Atlas gave me a reason to fight again, and because of him, I get to help others find that same hope. So, to anyone out there who feels lost, just know this. Sometimes, the ones we think we're rescuing are the ones who end up rescuing us. The audience stood and applauded, but Daniel wasn't looking at them. He was looking down at Atlas, his best friend, his guardian, his savior, and for the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The final chapter, a life well lived. Years passed, and Daniel's mission grew beyond what he ever imagined. He started his own nonprofit, training service dogs for veterans struggling with PTSD. He traveled across the country, sharing his story, proving that healing was possible. He helped countless veterans find their own Atlas, giving them the second chance they deserved. And through it all, Atlas was there. But dogs don't live forever. And one day, when Atlas had grown old and his paws were slower than before, Daniel knew their time together was coming to an end. The hardest goodbye. The day Atlas passed away, Daniel sat with him in their favorite spot on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Atlas rested his head in Daniel's lap, just like he had done so many times before. Daniel stroked his fur, his eyes filled with love, gratitude, and heartbreak. You saved my life, he whispered. Atlas let out a slow breath, his tail wagging one last time. And then, he was gone. But his legacy? It would live on forever. The legacy of Atlas. Years later, Daniel stood in front of a new group of veterans, all waiting to be paired with their own service dogs. At his side was a young Labrador retriever, full of life, eager to begin his journey. Daniel looked down at him, smiling. You've got some big shoes to fill, buddy, he murmured. The dog wagged his tail, ready for the challenge. And as Daniel spoke to the veterans, telling them about Atlas, telling them about the dog who saved his life, he realized something. Atlas may have been gone, but his spirit? It would always be right there, beside him, guiding him, watching over him. just like he always had. Because some bonds never break, and some love never fades. Not in this life. Not ever. The end. Final message. This story is a tribute to the incredible bond between humans and dogs, a bond that can heal, transform, and even save lives. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to know they are not alone. And always remember, sometimes, the ones we rescue are the ones who end up rescuing us. Love doesn't always come in the way we expect it. For Daniel, it came with 4 paws, a wagging tail, and a heart full of unconditional loyalty. If you were touched by this story, like, share, and subscribe to hear more incredible tales of how dogs change lives. Do you have a story of a dog who changed your life? Share it in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.